Good evening. It is February 26th. This is a special work session of the Government Operations and Health Facilities Subcommittee of the Health and Government Operations Committee. We are here tonight to discuss one bill, HB 500, the Procurement Reform Act of 2025. So over the next hour, my goal is for us to all get an understanding of the bill, hear from the major stakeholders where we are with the bill, identify the outstanding issues that need to be resolved, and determine next steps. I'm not looking to do any negotiating or discussion beyond information finding tonight. So if everyone is prepared, we'll go ahead and get started. We're joined by HGO Committee Counsel Lindsay Rowe, who's the lawyer who's been working on this bill. And I'd like to start by having Lindsay just briefly outline the bill for us.
Well, unfortunately, it's probably not going to be terribly brief. So broadly speaking, the administration bill makes changes to state procurement law related to governance and oversight, preference programs, payment practices, and master contracting. It also establishes new procurement programs or requirements for vendors related to good labor practices, use of interns and registered apprentices, and diversity plans. It also makes clarifying, conforming, and technical changes. I was prepared to go sort of page by page through the bill to discuss all of the changes. Would you like me to hold off on that? I'm sorry, Delegate Kerr, you're muted.
Let's see how that goes. If you could move quickly through that, that might be a good way to proceed.
All right, I'll do my best. Generally speaking, this is going in order of where things appear in the bill. Hopefully this is a one-time overview of everything that's happening.
Is this the amended version as of 2/19 at 3:46 p.m.? I mean, which version are you looking at?
I was going to do the bill as introduced first. I can also go through the amendments if that's a next step that you all would like to take. But I was going to start with where the bill was introduced.
I was going to ask if Mr. Chair, if the amendments, if we're looking at an interlineated version and the amendments are what the sponsor wants, can we just go through that? And Lindsay, maybe you could say this is what it did and the amendment will do that instead of going through it once and then going through it again?
But Lindsay, you could just get to the part where we have the strike throughs and indicate that those are the amendments that have been proposed and accepted by some of the parties. And
I can do that. I will say the amendments are not as extensive as the discussion of the bill itself would be. And I know that there's potentially some further discussion on what had previously been considered consensus amendments. So
yeah, so if you could just point out the amendments and how they changed the bill as we encounter them.
let me take this apart. All right, let's see what we can do. So the bill alters definitions of services, supplies as they relate to procurement by DGS and general procurement law, and defines information technology and statewide contract as they apply under general procurement law. These changes appear on pages 4, 6, and 8 of the bill. There's an amendment that appears on page 4 that adds another cross-reference correction in the bill to the natural resources article, and also alters the definition of supplies to include intangible property. That's also on page 4 of the bill. And on page 8 in the bill from the amendments alter the definition of statewide contract to mean a contract that is used by all units, not just any unit. Let's see, there's throughout the bill's altering the authority of the chief procurement officer. First, regarding reporting by units, that's on page 5. Authorizing non-competitive negotiation on page 14. Authorizing expedited procurements, also on page 14. Approving intergovernmental cooperative purchasing agreements on page 15. And authorizing the cancellation of a solicitation or rejection of all bids or proposals, that's on page 21. So I apologize. I'm going to then go back a little bit because that was sort of a broader topic. Back to page 10, the bill alters the authority of DGS to engage in procurement of information technology system modernization and cybersecurity upgrades and modernization. Also on page 10, via the amendments clarify that MDOT and MTA procurement of supplies and services include information technology supplies that are subject to Title 3.5 of the State Finance and Procurement article. Also on, I'm sorry, and I didn't mention that the bill alters the authority of MDOT and MTA to engage in the procurement of supplies and services for transportation-related activities. And then the amendment clarifies that that includes information technology supplies and services. The bill moves within the code provisions governing pay-for-success contracting. This is to clarify that this is a contract type, not a source selection method. So it's moved in code to reflect that. The new language for where it will newly be appearing is starting at the bottom of page 22 in the bill. On page 12, the bill authorizes the chief procurement officer to establish additional procurement methods of source selection. On page 13, the bill makes a correction consistent with the expansion of the small business preference that was under Chapter 653 of 2024. Throughout the bill standardizes various contract value thresholds that conform to the small procurement threshold that's in existing code. On page 15, the bill authorizes a primary procurement unit to limit or revoke a unit's ability to conduct small procurements if the unit does not adhere to small procurement regulations. On page 20, the bill requires an oral presentation for certain procurements based on contract value, except when the procurement officer makes a written determination that oral presentations are unlikely to aid in the evaluation process. Also on page 20, the bill establishes the dollar value for which a unit shall issue a solicitation for a task order to a certain number of master contractors. Let's see, moving to page 27, before a unit may award a procurement contract above $500,000, the bill authorizes the unit to require the recommended awardee to submit a workplace diversity plan to the procurement officer. And for a procurement office contract over $250,000, the procurement officer may require the recommended awardee to submit a supplier diversity plan. GOSBA, in consultation with the Office of State Procurement, must adopt regulations that include suggested content of the diversity plans and guidance for units to comply with these requirements. On pages 27 and 28, the bill alters and expands the Pricing and Selection Committee for preferred providers by removing the Secretary of General Services and replacing that with the Chief Procurement Officer, and also adds the Special Secretary for GOSBA. On page 28, the bill transfers the Employment Works program from DGS to GOSBA. On pages 28 and 29, the bill requires the special secretary for GOSBA rather than BPW to specify criteria for a business to qualify as a small business and to adopt regulations relating to small businesses. On pages 29 and 30, the bill requires the special secretary for GOSBA to consult with the chief procurement officer on developing the MBE goals, guidelines to consider when setting sub-goals, guidelines to consider when determining the appropriate MBE goal for a procurement contract, and procedures governing how participation of MBE prime contractors is counted towards contract goals. Let's see, on page 30, the bill authorizes a unit to consider altering the MBE participation goal on a procurement contract at certain times. And then on page 37, they do this, the bill does the same for veteran-owned small business enterprise participation goals. These, the language of these is altered via the amendments. Regarding the modification of an MBE participation goal on a procurement contract. That's pages 30 and 33, and for the veteran small business enterprise participation goal on page 37. Let's see. If a unit's procurement officer determines a deficiency exists in the MBE participation schedule, the bill requires the procurement officer to notify the bidder or offerer and require an amended MBE participation schedule be submitted, correcting the deficiency. That's on page 32, and the same again for if a deficiency exists under an VSBE participation schedule. The bill authorizes an MBE participation schedule to be amended to add or increase MBE participation only if it's in the best interest of the state. That's on page 33. And for VSBE participation, that adds the best interest of the state, that it is approved by the head of the unit, and that the contract must be amended. That language was already true for the MBE goal. That's on page 38. The bill on page 34 and 35 removes a requirement that MBEs must submit monthly submissions to the unit on payments received, but adds that the submission shall include any other information requested based on criteria established by GOSBA. The bill originally, but is being put back in via the amendment on page 35. The bill originally would have repealed a requirement that a bid or proposal on a solicitation that includes an expected MBE participation identify the specific commitment of certified MBEs at the time of the submission. Again, that's restored in the amendments. On page 36, the bill increases from $500,000 to $1 million, the total dollar value for which a procurement shall be designated for the small business reserve. The bill amendments on page 36 define reserve component and veteran for the purposes of the VSBE program. This was drafted to align it with what HGO had previously adopted under House Bill 138 earlier this session. The bill on page 38 and 39 creates a veteran-owned small business reserve program that's modeled after the small business reserve. On page 39 to 41, the bill establishes a new requirement that specified contractors use interns and registered apprentices. This applies to covered procurements, meeting criteria established by the Chief Procurement Officer in consultation with the Secretary of Labor, and that is not a public work contract. Contractors awarded a covered procurement must use a registered apprenticeship program, and those awarded a contract with a value of at least $1 million must use an eligible internship program. There are amendments on pages 39 and 40 to this that require the CPO to consult with the Secretary of Information Technology when establishing criteria for covered procurements that are subject to Title 3.5 of the State Finance and Procurement Article, and requires that regulations to carry out the article, the subtitle include a waiver processes. The bill originally established a good labor practices certification and preference for vendors that appeared on pages 42 to 46. The amendment struck that language, but I understand there's ongoing discussions on that piece. The bill established the policy of the state to make a payment under a procurement contract for a small business reserve contract within 15 days after the day on which the payment becomes due and the unit receives a proper invoice. That's on page 46. And the amendments on that same page establish that interest on unpaid invoices accrues in accordance with section 15104 of the State Finance and Procurement Article. That is existing code that's not changed. It just references it. We're almost done. On page 47, the bill establishes conditions under which a procurement officer may approve a contract modification. On page 48, the bill establishes that the State Apprenticeship Training Fund shall include penalties collected under the new Internship and Registered Apprenticeship Program, and that the fund shall be used to pay the costs of that program. On page 49, the bill allows for certain contract clauses governing non-discrimination to be substantially similar to that are provided under state law rather than identical to those provisions. On page 50, the bill requires departments with the Modernized Maryland Oversight Commission to establish a working group to study prompt payment features. Throughout the bill, there are cross-references corrected. Also on page 50 in the amendments, the amendments clarify that the definition of services, as it appears under the State Finance and, the State Personnel and Pensions article, does not include information technology services and cybersecurity. And the last thing, the amendments require the procurement advisor to BPW to conduct a study of the economic impacts of instituting an in-state preference for Maryland vendors for all state procurements and submit a report by December 1st, 2025.
Well, thank you. That was fairly brief. Let me turn first to the governor's office since it's their bill. Is Brad still with us, or would he like to?
Can we ask Lindsay some questions?
Sure, let's do that first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually did read / skim most of this bill and took a lot of notes on it a couple weekends ago. And we have that 15-page summary already from the governor's office. What Lindsay just gave was really helpful and could really use. I mean, I tried taking notes of all that, but if that's something that can be shared with everyone in some version. But similarly, I guess, Mr. Chairman, I would just also say to the governor's office, they gave a 15-page summary, but they did not indicate at any place where any of these things were happening in the bill, which made that summary not entirely helpful to me in trying to understand the bill. And then lastly, and I apologize, I'm doing a Terry Hill here. What I didn't hear was a lot about the purpose and some of the features of the bill, and there was a lot about IT modernization, which we're having problems with elsewhere. The bulk of the hearing was about, the bulk of the people testifying were about minority business enterprise, which is one piece of this bill and one aspect of what we're trying to do. And then we heard from a lot of labor groups who just care about one part of the bill, but I've very little bit heard from businesses that do business with the state. Are these things best practices? Are this going to make our procurement actually work? So I've got a lot. I'm just stuck. And anyway, I look forward to all the many other hours we spend on this.
Okay, thank you. Delegate Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we hear from the governor's office, I would like to know why the good labor practices were taken out of the bill. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, Brad Fallon, it's your microphone.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for having us. Mr. Chair, how would you like me to respond to some of the comments first?
Yeah, let's do that before.
Absolutely. Delegate Kaiser took a note. I will follow up and get you a updated version of that document that directly ties to each section. No problem at all. So we'll get working on that. Just give us a day or so, and I'll send that over to your office. On the do we
Not to
think
my
this is
office,
actually-
to everyone's office.
all the offices will do. On the will this actually improve things? I think I would point to the written testimony and that was submitted on this. From the National Association of State Procurement Officers to procurement experts, both in the state and out, that have weighed in, and individual companies that have come in and said this is going to really modernize the system. We really believe so. I do take your point. This bill is a lot of things. It's an omnibus package that touches into different constituencies. No doubt there is an MBE component of this. There is also just hey, let's make sure that we are helping small businesses, regardless of whether they're minority business enterprises. And the best way to do that is by streamlining and modernizing the system. And so I think when we look at this bill, we do see it improving MBE's business with the state, but not just because it is directly tailored towards MBEs, but because they tend to be smaller businesses in this circumstance that really stand to benefit from a more streamlined process. In some cases, this is also a good government bill, right? There's some parts of efficiencies, say the contract modification section that I'm sure we may speak about. For us, that has just been a significant operational challenge. And so, in part of that is just us being good stewards of this process and saying, hey, here's an issue that we're having, here's a solution for it, and look forward to working with everybody to figure out the right path. So I think on those initial pieces, and I'll get that, and Delegate Kaiser, I will reach out as well and with the OSP team. If there's anything else we can continue to talk through, happy to make ourselves available whenever on that. On Delegate Johnson's question, I appreciate it. And, I think there are a couple bits of clarification from where we are on this. Where we look to come, given it's such a massive bill, and in conversations with members of the committee and kind of the spirit of HGO compromise, what we look to do is have the first hearing in the Senate, hear where the major concerns were, and then bring you all a version that satisfied at least most of those concerns, right? The concerns came in, and we heard a lot of concerns about the good labor certified business section of the bill. For those that are not in depth familiar with that section, that would have been a 5% price preference, or would be as the bill is drafted, for businesses that can attest to the Commissioner of Labor and to the procurement officer that they adapt certain good labor principles. That ranges from things like paying their employees in W-2, paying through payroll, joint and several liability, and other things. We support that policy. Clearly, as it was submitted in the bill, that's why it was submitted. And we would stand by that it is in line with our values, right? We just also understand that there were significant concerns that seemed to be concentrated on that section from folks that we heard prior to the hearing and at the hearing from all sorts of stakeholder groups, right? It wasn't one camp of folks that were concerned about that. So kind of in that compromise spirit and in recognition that that makes up, 5 or 10% of an otherwise modernizing bill that have different constituencies. What we had endorsed or agreed to, and at least recommended to the committee and deferred to you all on the ultimate decision here, is to remove that section, allow us to work on it on a continuous basis, get stakeholders together in a room, and come to something that is more baked. That really was the way that we approached that at the hearing, to say, hey, we are okay with that coming out, not because we don't stand by or support the policy, but by recognizing that there is just room for compromise and we wouldn't sacrifice the entire bill for, any one individual section, because we think that there was a lot of good things in here. That's probably too long of a response, but I've been talking about this all day.
Actually, no, that's a sufficient response. It's just a trade-off. I mean, you talk about our values, but then we're sacrificing our workers. And I'm not seeing the trade-off where we're still allowing the 1099s, not W-2 workers. And I just, me personally, I have an issue with that. I don't want to be talking out of both sides of our mouths when you talk about our core values. Core values are our workers and our folks. So I just want to make sure that's known. Is where I'm coming from.
Okay,
Anyways.
thank you, Delegate Johnson. Delegate Hill?
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Brad, I just want to follow up. So I heard you say that that was the only section that gave angst in the Senate. You said for a host of reasons, it was easier to take it out than to compromise the whole bill, which doesn't sound like it was negotiated or discussed at all. So Ken, since this is a work session, can you first of all tell us what the concerns were? Second of all, since we're not even at crossover yet, can you have those discussions about, rather than take it out, why not have those discussions about that section now?
Yeah, and we're happy to, right? We completely recognize,
I mean,
we've
with the
handed this
Senate
bill over
too.
to legislative session. It wasn't the only, and I apologize if I misspoke, it wasn't the only concern, but it was a significant concern
And
raised.
what were the concerns? Just there were many concerns about that.
Yeah, there were many concerns on that, but the entirety of the amendments all addressed some concern that was raised because we were very much in a move forward mode. We did work very well, closely with the contractors. We did not default to looking to drop the section. There were various ideas thrown out there about not making this a price preference and rather making it a requirement where there's an attestation at the point of putting in for a bid, for instance. Where that came in, there were a few points that folks had real consternation about within that list. Some of it is just ensuring compliance with current law, but there are others that are not, right? And that's why we were looking to give that 5% bonus. In the Senate, there were some concerns raised about the fiscal impact of allowing contracts to be increased by that 5% in the current environment and what impact that would have, particularly because there weren't limitations on the contracts that it would be applied to. So we sat with the with the contractors diligently. We were looking to bring something to this committee where we could say we have folks on board because there was such a large bill and so much to dig into with individual members. With all of that, our decision was more so, or at least our recommendation to the committee was more so, let's take it out because I'm not sure that we figured everything out about how to work this. And this will take a lot of time, right? And so this may be something for us to bring back at a later date. If the committee wants to move it, we're not going, we're not sitting here just to protest because I understand it's the committee's bill.
Thanks, Brad. So you talked with the contractors. Did you have the similar discussions with the labor representatives?
We hadn't, and I'll tell you, we brought this kind of section on our own. It didn't come from a request. We had not engaged. We had not heard from the unions on this component. And it may have just been something that flew under the radar. Given that, candidly, our prioritization was really folks that weighed in and expressed concerns one way or the other on this. So we pulled those folks to the table. It wasn't meant to be intentionally exclusive. It was just kind of who weighed in the Senate.
All right, thanks. Jamie and John Willems, I saw you were here from DGS. Do you have
Good
do you have
evening.
anything to say at this point about how this will affect your operations?
Overall, I think it's going to be very helpful for our procurement office to be able to move and streamline procurements and be able to have more oversight on the agencies and their procurement processes.
John, anything to add?
I would just add, in addition to what, Brad Fallon indicated, is that we are working at the interagency level in good faith with our partners in the comptroller's and treasurer's office to negotiate other significant issues still pending related to the bill. And so, we appreciate the committee's attention to these consensus amendments, if you will, that a lot of work has already gone into. And so we look forward to then honing in on the few remaining issues.
So I see that we received some letters from the comptroller's office and from the treasurer's office, and I saw that a lot of the requests from the comptroller's office were incorporated, but there still remains the one about the $50,000 going to the $1 million.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
There's two parts to that section, Delegate Kerr. The first part is the small procurement threshold for the procurement officers themselves. So
What page?
sorry.
Or section?
Yes. It's the new section 13112.1.
Okay, go ahead, Jamie. We'll catch up with the page.
Okay, sorry. So in that section, it talks about it. It adds a contract modification section to statute, because currently there is no contract modification section at all, and it allows the procurement officers to approve small procurement threshold modifications. So right now we have $50,000 available for modifications. However, procurement officers have delegation for small procurements up to 100,000. So it's to line up with the 100,000 that the procurement officers are already delegated and can conduct small procurements on their own and do small contracts up to 100,000. And so this would allow them to be able to do that for modifications as well within that delegation. And then the second part of it is the $1 million for the CPO. So anything from the 100,000 that the agency could approve up to the $1 million for the CPO to approve before it would have to go to the Board of Public Works. And we're working with the comptroller's office and the treasurer's office on options for that as well. But our goal is to get the procurement, at least the procurement officer side, and we have to work on the CPO approval level. That would be great.
Okay, so there are ongoing discussions on that aspect.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I saw Davon was on the call. Do you want to
Sir.
give the MBE perspective on this with the perhaps with the amended out section?
We work closely with DGS on the legislation, specifically for the SBR threshold, and the VSBE piece. Our only issue with the MBE piece was actually the MBE participation schedule being repealed from the legislation. However, that was actually placed back in the bill. But other than that, we have no other concern.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
From the treasurer's office, Laura.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Delegate. I'm here also with Joanna Kelly. She's our BPW liaison. Hello.
Hi. Do you want to give treasurer's perspective?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Treasurer Davis, as he said at the hearing, is focused on mainly just flagging for the committee. There's 4 provisions in the bill that would take away BPW's authority to review certain aspects of the procurement process. And so I submitted to committee council earlier today the amendments that would be needed in addition to what's reflected in the reprint. But you've already discussed one of those, which is the contract modification provisions. The treasurer feels strongly that the existing thresholds are appropriate and that, you know, when the board has visibility and oversight, the legislature retains its authority. And so he is recommending that the status quo remain. The other amendments touch on when solicitations are canceled or all bids are rejected. He thinks it's important that the board have an opportunity to weigh in on those matters and receive notice of them on the PAR reports. And then in addition, the expedited procurement provision of the bill, he thinks that the board should be able to approve whether that method of procurement is appropriate. And then for source selection, I think that there's agreement on that area. But the treasurer again wants to make sure that the board can approve any new methods of source selection.
And the status quo that you referred to, that's the 50,000?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Jamie.
I just wanted to thank Laura and Joanna for bringing up the source selection in our submission of amendments that we all agreed to. There was the additional language for that section of the bill to add, subject to Board of Public Works approval prior to the CPO creating new source selection methods.
Thank you. Secretary Chaudhry. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to I don't want to go, I know we're going into the weeds on a lot of these issues and aspects here, but just wanted to reiterate for the committee here that, procurement is one thing that we've heard time and time again. It's just a huge challenge across state government. And it's a big issue hindering agencies from getting goods and services in a timely manner. And that's why we're taking on this huge initiative. And the big thing I tell everyone is, hey, look, if this was easy, this would have been done many years ago, but it's very challenging as we're hearing here. A lot of amendments, a lot of input, a lot of constituent stakeholders have input here. I think the bill has a lot of aspects and opportunities here to really streamline a lot of procurement functions. It's a very technical bill. So it is very specific on some nuanced measures that will help, address some of the challenges our procurement officers are facing on a daily basis. As an example, just one of the main examples is contract modifications, being able to do that. Example, contrary in other states in the federal government, contract modifications are just normal course of business that you normally do. So those type of things that being able to do that without additional hurdles of Board of Public Works approval and other things can certainly help facilitate expedite moving things along faster when it comes to procurements. But we are absolutely committed to engaging with all the stakeholders, all the members of the committee, as well as on the Senate side as well, to try and address this and get this to the finish line and make sure we're able to help serve our agencies and therefore Marylanders more efficiently and effectively.
Thank you, Secretary. Brad, you had mentioned that something about the Senate moving the bill. Can you tell us where they are right now?
Yeah, I touched base with them earlier today just to verify kind of where we're standing on that. I did tell them that there was some things that we're still sorting out and that we had this work section today. And so I think they're holding for right now. They'll want to do the same thing. But since the House kind of moved first on this, I think they're in a posture of saying, all right, well, let's see kind of what comes down there with the various stakeholders, and then it'll help inform kind of where we are across the street.
Okay, so they're in about the same position that we are, the same
That's right.
stage of finding.
Yeah, they're ready to pull it in. Start
Okay.
moving.
All right. Now, Sean Malone, I know that that representing the contractors
Yeah.
that that you
Sure.
were working on the agreement that got the amendment that took out page 42 to 46? Can you?
Well, yeah, so, sure. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, absolutely. We represent the Maryland Minority Contract Association as well as Associated Builders and Contract Association. So in this subtitle 9, it's 42 to page 44. It creates a new concept in Maryland procurement where a very significant price preference is given if a contractor is willing to certify that they'll do 10 things. Of the 10 things, 9 of them are things that would make them a responsible contractor eligible to bid anyways. So but the one significant, well, 2 changes, but one significant change is they would subject themselves to be jointly and severally liable for 5 titles of employment law, but several different laws, and that is a significant change. And in fact, it kind of runs contrary to the whole concept of workers' classification, where general contractors cannot direct and control the actions and work of a subcontractor. In return for that, a 5% at minimum preference is provided on the price on the bidding. So if you take, for instance, the Key Bridge, which could be a $2 billion project, the state would be sending an additional $100 million. And frankly, all the contractors that we represent would rather not see that money in a price preference, but would rather see it go to build another facility in the state. I think what we had suggested to the governor's office as well at different points is that, look, you could certainly require as part of the procurement that they attest that they're going to, essentially it's that they're going to follow these laws, which they're required to do anyways. So I'm not sure where the benefit of the bargain is there for the state. It's certainly not for us because we're starting to open the door to price preferences. And we'll be back down here every session looking to add another issue, another item to provide preferences or increase preferences. And I'm not sure that changes this procurement model significantly in a way that certainly from the minority contractors we represent, they're very concerned. The joint and several liabilities are concerned because it starts to box out our smaller contractors who want to grow into larger contractors because they simply can't take that risk. So they'd be at a disadvantage to a bigger company, a Whiting and Turner, who may or may not be willing to take that risk of jointly and severally being liable for all employees on the job. Now, under Maryland law, under the prevailing wage law, we already hold them. We already protect workers for pay and benefits if a subcontractor violates prevailing wage. We submit certified payroll sheets. There's significant protections already in place. So we're just not, but the subjecting them to joint and several liability in return for what could be $100 million preference is very significant. With regard to Delegate Johnson's concern about 1099 employees, that's already addressed in workers' classification. A company can't walk on the job with 10 1099s on a public works project. However, under that law, there is an exempt personnel, and that is the sole proprietor who has their own truck, their own equipment, works without direction. And under that law, those sole proprietors can choose to pay workers' comp, not pay workers' comp, pay unemployment, not pay unemployment for themselves. Now, if they have an employee, they don't fall into that. So this is a very narrow exception, but these gig workers are prominent and they're traditional in the construction. You may have someone who's a very good finisher and they work for themselves and they run their own business. This would preclude them from working on these jobs. So we just think that this section, I think, as the governor's office said, they want to take a little more work into it, and we'd love to be at the table for that. We weren't a part of this drafting. This was done by, I think this was inserted by the Labor Department. This was not part of the procurement work task force. This wasn't one of their recommendations. This was added. And we're happy to work with all stakeholders, but we just don't think of those 10 certifications, 9 of them, a good contractor, a responsible contractor's bidding is already going to meet. So the only thing the state's getting for that is a willingness to be held jointly and severally liable if somebody violates. So that was our concern, and that's what we expressed. But this is a really, our contractors have expressed a lot of concern about establishing this idea of preferences in contracts. Required if you're going to require it, but putting a 5% or upwards is problematic for us.
Thank you, Sean.
Yes.
Roger Mano, we had a brief conversation yesterday, I believe, and you held an opposite view to that. Do you want to briefly explain your position? And you're muted still?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks everyone for holding this work session. And it's good to see Secretary Chowdhury, and thank you, Brad, for including these provisions in the original bill. Mr. Chair, as we mentioned yesterday, I represent a consortium of construction trades unions, the ironworkers, the carpenters, the UA, represented regionally by the Mid-Atlantic Pipe Trades Association. I see Jason Asher, who's the political director, is on this Zoom. I also represent, with regard to contractors, probably 200 signatory union contractors. None of these organizations were appraised of not just the strikes in this amendment that we're looking at right now, but the original provisions of the bill. So while we are grateful that the governor's office put these provisions in the bill, and they're very strong worker protections, we're concerned that they're being stricken by this amendment. To the comments earlier from John Willems over at DGS, respectfully, I'm not sure where the narrative began that this is a consensus amendment. Nobody in labor, and I think I can speak for everyone in labor, although I represent who I mentioned before, no one in the building trades saw any of this coming. Nobody at AFL saw any of this coming. No one at SEIU. This is sort of the first we heard of it was when we watched the Senate hearing, and the lobbyists for the Associated Building contractors asked that the committee strike pages 42 through 46 of the bill. At that point, we immediately convened. Labor and the hundreds of contractors that I mentioned before. We wrote letters to the committee because the window with which to submit testimony had closed. You should have all received emails. We also emailed the Senate as well, and we started having conversations. So that's the background of our position. I guess our position is that even though this bill was not on our radar screen, we support the bill as introduced. We're thankful for the provisions that were added by the governor's office, notwithstanding some pushback that we've received from this committee and the committee across the street based on some of the provisions that are in the bill that members find concerning, that are largely unrelated to labor. But that aside, we support the bill as introduced. We appreciate the work of the governor and of this committee. As long as those labor provisions on pages 42 through 46 remain, should they be stricken, we oppose the bill.
Thank you for that explanation. Let me turn to my committee and take some questions. Delegate Hill.
Thank you. And I think I understood Raj and Sean to both say that 42 to 46, labor had not known it was going to be in, but once they saw it, they really liked it. It was contractors didn't ask for it to be taken out. Labor wants to keep it. So here's my question. The joint
excuse me, Delegate.
Yeah.
When you say contractors, I represent some 200 signatory union contractors. None of them had any heads up about these provisions being stricken from the bill.
Right, or being put in, as if I heard you right.
Correct.
It was a surprise both ways. So, and by contractors, I'm talking about who Sean's talking about, not the trades. So here's this joint and severable liability. Where else do we do this? And maybe that's a question for you all. Maybe it's a question for Lindsay. And because that seems to be the 5% is a sticking point. That's a sticking point. And this ninth thing that just separates it from other certifiable good practice, whatever, as Sean explained. So talk to me about the joint and severable liability. Talk to us about that. And what does that mean? And do we do that anywhere else?
We do it in prevailing wage. We hold general contractors and higher tier contractors jointly and severally liable, with the idea being that if a lower sub it's the idea of getting the employee taken care of first. And but we do not do it in the other areas. And I mean, this talks about, this would cover parental leave, healthy working families, organ donation, criminal history, equal pay, wage and hours. It is OSHA violations, unemployment insurance, workers' comp. So, and then obviously prevailing wage, but that's already joint and several. So it then makes us joint and severally liable for a whole list of other items. And I think, there's a provision in here that requires to say to us, a general to say to a sub, here's all your obligations under the law. And the worker misclassification bill requires them to sign off as certifying that. If they don't, the general can be brought into the suit. But it's an advisement, and it ends up being evidence should a subcontractor not pay unemployment insurance or not pay workers' comp insurance. So this is a significant change in the law, and that's what when we saw it, we attended the hearing. And by the way, just to clarify, we did not ask for all pages to be stricken. That was not what the testimony wasn't sent. That's not what the amendment that was circulated. Okay. We had a more precise amendment, but because the other stuff is already required, and so if you want to put it in the bill, put it in. But general contractors who've been at this level are already doing these things.
So Roger, why is this joint and severable appropriate for this section? If this part is, but why is that something that ought to be here?
Joint and several exist in other parts of the law. We think that it's a good incentive for maintaining good relations between subs and primes, as are many other aspects of prevailing wage law, contract law. We appreciate the governor putting it in the bill, and we think that it's a good provision that we support.
Is that provision a deal breaker, as opposed to the rest of 42 through 46?
We support sections, pages 42 through 46, as was mentioned before.
Deal breaker.
Yes, it is.
Severable.
We support those sections as originally introduced in the bill, and if they're stricken, we oppose the bill.
Thank you.
Delegate Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Mano. I asked this question by email, but I heard you say something again tonight that has confused me. I keep hearing you say, pass the bill unamended, but we only care about pages 42 through 46. So let me confirm. The other sections of the bill are not what your members care about, because when I get letters from 10 unions saying, don't amend the bill at all, and I'm thinking, why do you care about the small business reserve? Why do you care about the veterans reserve? Why do you care about the changing amount? Why do you care about cutting out BPW? Why do you care about the chief procurement officer? So I just want to make sure I understand. What are the only provisions of the bill that you care about?
Well, as I mentioned before, Delegate Ness, I mentioned in our email exchange, we care about pages 42 through 46, where this bill was not on our radar screen.
So the point of don't amend the bill, you just mean don't touch those 4 pages. You're not endorsing the rest of the bill in any way, shape, or form, plus, minus, amended or not. Is that correct?
I think that's probably getting murky for me. I need to go back and run that by the folks that I work for. But my understanding is that our position is support without amendment.
Okay, I would like that clarification because I find that very confusing since all anyone talked about were those 4 pages, and yet you seem to love the rest of the bill, even though you don't have any opinions on the other parts of the bill. So I'd
Let me
love
ask
to
you,
hear
Delegate,
them later.
what are the provisions of the bill other than pages 42 through 46 that you have problems or that you take exception to?
I don't. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the bill and make sure I understand it. I'm just trying to understand why I keep getting all these letters that say, don't amend the bill at all, when there's 47 other pages to the bill that you seemingly don't care about, and I'm just trying to understand, what y'all mean. If you only mean those 4 pages, then say you only mean those 4 pages. It's a little confusing. That's
We
all.
support
Thank you.
pages 42 through 46 in the bill. Without a bill, there are no pages 42 through 46. So we would support the passage of the bill with those provisions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Kaiser. Delegate Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mono, since you just found out that these pages were being taken out, is there anything on these pages that you would be okay with taking out? Any kind of compromise, since it was just sprung on you? Have you had a chance to really dig into these to see any of these provisions that you would be okay with taking out?
I'm not at liberty to say that there's any amendment to what I just said before.
Is there?
Our position's pretty cut and dry. Sean Malone testified in the Senate that he supports the bill with the amendment to strike the labor language on pages 42 to 46. I'm paraphrasing. That was what we found objectionable, not anything else in the bill necessarily. So that's the issue that we come to you to ask you to maintain in the bill.
Is there going to be any further discussion or on compromise on those 4 pages?
Well, that's what we hope happens, Delegate.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Donna Edwards is unable to be on the call, but she's watching the live stream. So she's kept up to speed with what's going on here. And Delegate Kaiser, Donna just said the answer to your question is yes. Pages 42 to 46 that you asked.
Okay, just checking. The letters all said something entirely different, so I'm glad to get that clarification from Ms. Edwards. Thank you.
Delegate Hill.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Sean the question. Sean, you just said that in the Senate, you had not requested that 42 and 46 come out. There are other parts of the bill that you've commented on. So are you okay with 46 and 42 staying in, maybe with several liability gone? You made some other suggestions about it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I think, yes, ma'am. I think that I think we profit. Well, I think there's an issue about putting the labor commissioner up front in the procurement process. It seems odd, but the good labor practices certification isn't necessary if you're not giving a preference. But we proffered, and I think I sent to the governor's office asked me to look at it again last night. We proffered amendments that would change 23 through 25, that when awarded, it would require the awardee to certify as to number 1, which is directly employing W-2 employees, with the giving exemption like they do in worker misclassification for exempt workers. Number 2, we were fine with. 3, we were fine with. 4, we were fine with. 5, we were fine with. 6, we were fine with, which is getting written acknowledgement of the laws that its subcontractors required to. We do that under worker misclass. 7 talks about motion inspection. We're okay with. 8, we are not. That's joint and several liability under those 5 areas. 9, we had a slight amendment with regards to, we will certainly disclose any suits that relate to us. We have no problems with subcontractors disclosing that, but we don't want to have to track that down for contractors we don't control and we're not allowed to control under misclassification, but we're generally okay with 9. And 10 10 doesn't really apply to us because we do construction bonds. Anyways, that seems to be more in line for living wage. I think that's what it's tied to. So yeah, and then when you get to 44 and 45, that's really talking about, that's all for the certification, get a 5% preference at minimum, which is, if we're not giving the preference, those sections aren't needed at all. But because our position is, you don't have to pay us to do it. We'll do these things. It's a joint and several liability. So that's kind of our position, and that's what our position was in the Senate. The governor's office said, hey, we're thinking of taking this out because, as Brad said, they had more work to do on it. There were some things that they wanted to get through. We said, that's fine. We were okay with that. And in return, we would support the bill. Our concerns were addressed. So happy to work, as we always are, with the committee. We understand this is your bill. And we'll work with you on it to address those concerns. And go into, when it's not so late, I can go into more detail about how the impacts on MBEs, what we're concerned with.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Yes, sir.
Jasmine, I didn't see you until now, and I had on the list here to call on the comptroller's office, but let me go ahead and give you a chance to speak.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chair. And I promise I'll be very brief. It is late in the evening, but and Jamie briefly touched on the amendments, but we do align with the Treasurer's Office, and that our focus with the discussions with the Governor's Office is to look at the items that impact the Board of Public Works Authority. And the Comptroller would like to preserve that as much as possible, since that is a way of ensuring, our great bond rating and is our only visibility into some of the MBE issues and things like that. And I just wanted to mention one other amendment that we were looking to pursue is around the master contracting levels, which tiers it out and changes how the master contracting task orders are awarded. We are in conversations with the Governor's Office, but we do have concerns about the equitable access to these master contracts for those that do get on there if we do shift to this change. So, but as John said, we've been in conversations and we hope we can get to some consensus on those last remaining items.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for being here. We are up on the hour, everyone. And here's where I see we are at this point, that we've got the issue of the BPW oversight. We have the increase of 500,000 to $1 million. We have the 5%, actually the whole subtitle 9 on pages 42 to 46. And then one other thing that's outstanding that didn't come up yet tonight is the fiscal note. There's a $276,000 fiscal note that we need to figure out how to pay for. Where's the money going to come from? So what I would like to do between now and the next time we get together is, Brad, if someone from the Governor's Office could coordinate meetings between the contractors and labor to go over the subtitle 9. If you could also have someone from your office get the DGS together with the treasurer and the comptroller to look at those other issues and address the issue of the fiscal note. And if you have anything to report back by the end of the week, get back in touch with me. If we've made significant progress, we can find some time Monday to meet. Otherwise, this will go to subcommittee again next Wednesday. All right, that's I think this was a good start, everyone, and I appreciate the substantive conversation. I appreciate your attendance as well as your patience with waiting for us to get out of committee. So I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting, and we'll be in touch and determine next steps. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.